What's going on, 3DMJers? We are back with another episode, and I have our team dietitian. That's Steve Taylor, RD, MSRD. Don't want to take away your master's degree. Apologies. And I also have Brian Miner. I guess he has a master's too. No, I'm just kidding. We got our newest coach on the team, Brian Miner, the Rook. And so can you keep a straight face? We've got Steve Taylor on, and today we're going to be talking about aspects of nutrition that we sometimes have our clients track that don't fit into the neat, nice categories of calories, protein, carbs, and fat, and how useful that can be, why, and what circumstances we use them, and also how we coach around that, and what the purpose is, and how we can use those tools to sometimes help our clients, whether they are trying to perform better or potentially modify their body composition. So for those who are familiar with our content, you might be aware of the muscle and strength pyramids. Them are videos I did back in 2012. I don't know why I got Southern there for a second. And also that have become books. And from in them, I actually talk about kind of a useful heuristic to not only hit your fiber target, but to also ensure that you've got a fair, good spread of micronutrients. And I generally recommend having, depending on whether you're dieting or not and how much this impacts satiety, just getting 1 serving of fruit and 1 serving of vegetables for every 500 or 1,000 calories respectively in your diet. And that's a very simple heuristic, but we're going to get deeper than that today and really talk through it. So Steve, as the resident RD, and one who is very familiar with pyramids that then became plates, that I know you probably have posters on your wall that you walk up to, and yep, you give them a shout out. You gotta, like, exactly. It's got the MyPlate USD.
I can't show you where that's at, but I do have one.
That's right. USDA.gov tattoo on your body, praying to the RD gods. Talk to me about what are some of your systems that you use with your athletes? Do you use certain nutrients that you track that are outside of the macros on a regular basis, or is this more case by case?
So my technically my full on tracking is calories, protein, fruits, veggies, and fiber. And then whenever we're done tracking calories, they will still track fruits, veggies, and then servings of protein. So yeah.
Nice. So when you say servings of protein, that sounds like they're not tracking grams. Are they tracking like servings of protein content foods, or we're talking about that?
So typically, like during the full on tracking phase, they'll kind of know what their gram goal is. And then based on how they like to eat, I'll have them take that gram goal and divide that by 3 or 3, 4, or 5. And then basically that becomes like their meal goal. And so it's let's say their goal is 160 grams a day and they like to eat protein 4 times per day. Their goal is breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then like a snack before bed, try to get at least 40 grams of protein. And that helps them keep track of where their protein is at without having to micromanage and know exactly what their total gram is.
I like that. I think it brings the focus of the client onto what do I actually do when I sit down to eat, and that is one aspect I kind of like. We were joking about the USDA food pyramid and then MyPlate, but I actually do like the change to MyPlate, because it gives a visual representation of what a meal should look like rather than a more abstract perspective on kind of what should your general diet be built up of. Also, they're encroaching upon my IP, so those letters from our very, very real lawyers in Delaware clearly shifted that United States decision. Don't let them fool you as to the reason for why they switched to MyPlate. But no, I really do like that, because I think getting people to focus on what happens when they sit down, it makes these things more tangible. When I think you give someone, especially someone who's not super in our community or educated on nutrition, like these abstract daily gram targets, it can be a little bit disconnected from reality. So I think that makes sense. So talk to me, what does it take to get someone from, as you describe it, full tracking, where they're doing calories, protein, fruits, vegetables, to where you're focusing on fewer things? What does that process look like for you?
I guess it's a combination of things. Typically, most of the people who reach out to me, it's for fat loss. And so as they go through the fat loss phase, they'll be doing full on tracking. And the main reason that I even do tracking is because, and I'm sure you guys would agree, is you just learn so much about food. So it's like there's plenty of people who can run a fat loss phase and never track and lose weight and keep it off. But it's just like I think it's like it just taught me so much about food, just that process of tracking, that I really think it's like invaluable for if somebody can go through it and not become too obsessive. I think it's definitely worth that investment. So like for me, that's like they will do that full on tracking. And I'll still go through phases where like maybe they're going on vacation for a week. I'll say, okay, just now practice not tracking calories, but just practice, eating your fruits, veggies, and protein, and just listening to your hunger and fullness signals. But basically, however that looks like, whenever we start to transition into maintenance, that's when I'll kind of officially like kind of get away from tracking calories. And I typically like taper that. And so it depends on where the person's at and how much anxiety or whatever they have around getting away from tracking. But it could be something as simple as like 1 week we go to 6 days full tracking, 1 day of just protein, fruits, and veggies. And then the next week we go to 4 days full tracking, 3 days just protein, fruits, and veggies. And the next week, 2, 5, 1, 6, and we just slowly taper away like that. And ideally, way before we even get there, like they already have a good structure in place. So it's like they already are used to eating at kind of the same times, and they're not just like randomly snacking throughout the day. And they've already kind of found the foods that help them hit their targets that they enjoy. And so they're ready to do that. And so that's kind of the tapering process that I use. And it can vary depending on the person and how things are going. But yeah, that's generally how that goes.
Well, golly gee whiz, Steve, I feel like you could teach a whole course on how to transition away from tracking. And myself personally, dear listener, I would pay for something like that inside of a place called the 3DMJ Vault, just putting it out there. No, but in all seriousness, that is, I really like that system. I like that you use the number of days as a way to kind of shift them and provide some more confidence, really kind of build that muscle, and then shift into maintenance. I think that's a really cool perspective. One thing you mentioned, which I think is worth going into even more, is that I think sometimes when tracking comes up, people think immediately, especially in the bodybuilding community, like what are the relevant variables that's going to affect the outcome I care about, and that's what I should track. Kind of the old adage, what's measured gets managed, and you only want to measure the things that are going to impact performance, right? But I think from a broader perspective, and considering that in reality we have a lot of people across kind of the educational spectrum, if you will, of knowledge about nutrition, understanding your habits by tracking is kind of the hidden gem that is probably the most important aspect, especially when you're working with non-competitors or less experienced competitors, or competitors with a background that's a little more traditional, just on like cleaner, unclean food type of thing, and they're transitioning to thinking of foods and their constituent nutrients a little more objectively. I think that educational piece is huge. And when you have people have the ability to track things, what they track is going to become what they value and what they understand and what they get education about. So if you're just having them track macros or calories, that becomes the thing at the forefront of their mind. And as we've come to understand with more and more time in the nutrition space and looking at nutritional epidemiology and what relates to long-term health, happiness, all that good stuff, we're starting to understand that the overly reductionist approach in nutrition science that we've historically had, it doesn't perfectly explain everything. And while it's probably beyond the scope of this podcast, I would definitely recommend people listen to some of the recent episodes in Sigma Nutrition Radio that, the public health guidelines of let's reduce sodium, saturated fat, sugar, and some of these things and control calorie intake. I think those are not bad by any means, and I think those are useful, but they are disconnected from the way people typically think, and people think in foods, not in nutrients, typically in the general population. And foods are more than their constituent parts. One thing I think is quite interesting is if you look at the typical Western diet and you look at the macronutrient breakdown, it's typically a moderate carbohydrate, moderate fat, moderate protein diet. It is also a moderate protein, moderate fat, moderate protein diet, the Mediterranean diet. From a macronutrient perspective, the Mediterranean diet and the Western diet are quite similar, yet they have very different relationships in terms of lifespan and life quality. So there is more to foods than their constituent macronutrients. So if we want to educate our clients about foods, having them just track macros can sometimes get them away from the point. And I would say even myself, as someone who is reasonably well educated about nutrition, When I was just tracking my macros, you would start to think about like, well, what's it matter? You know, if I'm hitting my macros, it's all good, and kind of thinking maybe too reductionist in terms of how I viewed my food. But again, I don't think we're here going to hear and have an anti if it hit your macros podcast that's been done for the last decade. But what I do think is important to point out is that this is an opportunity for you to help your clients learn about their habitual intakes and how to change them. And if you want to highlight something mentally or bring it to the forefront for them, you probably want them to track it. So tracking things like vegetables and fruit intake, I think, is a really good tool, or whatever else you might want to include in their diet. So that was a bit of a monologue for me. But anyway, those are my thoughts on that. I don't know how you guys feel.
It's interesting when you talk about being like overly zoomed in like that, because I can't tell you like how many times I've had someone come to me who's been tracking macros for years, and I have them switch to like a calories perspective, and they're like, completely lost. Like they can look at a meal and estimate the macro breakdown, but like when you have them start to think about like more zoomed out and think about calories, it's like they've never thought about food like that. And in my opinion, like long-term wise, it's more helpful to know the calories, just to be able to quickly look at the calories and protein of a food compared to like each of the little individual pieces.
Uh,
So I thought that was
uh-huh.
just a cool, like what you just said. I've seen that over and over and over again.
It speaks to how we kind of get locked into the paradigm that we think through and that we practice, because that's what, you know, tracking your macros on a regular basis is. And it's funny, I did my whole last contest prep is just calories and protein, and it does shift the way you think about foods and look at things. And I would say it also benefited me a little more from a satiety perspective. I wasn't locked into thinking, oh shit, I only have 20 grams of carbs, but I have 30 grams of fat left. What the hell kind of meal is that? I'm guessing I'm grabbing a bunch of nuts, you know? Um, I was more so thinking, okay, so I have like 400 calories or 500 calories left. What gets me to my protein target that I'm going to feel good about right now, that I'll feel satiated, that I'll be ready to go to bed with? And it just gives you more options and flexibility. And you can think about things from the qualitative side, which I think enhances adherence, or at the very least reduces stress if your adherence is already good. Um, and increases the subjective experience of dieting. So, yeah, I think that trade-off in most cases is worth it if you have a basis of nutritional habits where you're not going to be veering in wild, you know, ranges in terms of carbs and fat anyway, as an athlete. So, yeah, those have just been my experiences.
Yeah, one thing you kind of mentioned, Eric, like tracking the calories and protein. Like the last time I competed, it was the same thing, and it's a completely different shift in kind of how you approach things. And I think traditional, you know, back 2010, 2012ish. I mean, a lot of people were still and still do track each individual macronutrient like down to the gram, as if like their success is dictated on whether or not you are hitting these things down to the gram. And I think it's important, anybody that I work with where we're trying to kind of get away from that, it's making them realize like, okay, our expenditure isn't fixed every single day. Like there's no reason to expect success to be predicated off of hitting these to the gram. And so having, like a caloric range and kind of giving yourself some leeway, knowing like, okay, regardless of where I fall within this, plus or minus 100 calorie range, I know I'm a step closer to my goals. It's not, if you're 100 calories over, you're still, in a fat loss phase, you're still going to be in a deficit. And, if hunger was there, it's like you kind of address satiety through that flexibility. But yeah, I think I can't remember the last time I've assigned firm macros to people unless it's like trying to keep a menu more or less not fixed, but within kind of more narrow parameters later in a prep where, there's, swings in carbohydrate intake and fat intake, radical changes in those ratios can lead to less predictability in performance. But as a whole, I think it's been good to see, the community kind of coming around to the fact that, calories are what matter the most, and protein kind of addresses the you want to call it, like the qualitative aspect of what you're gating and losing to some extent. And from there, there's quite a bit of flexibility as long as you're like, I always look at it in terms of like the analogy of finance. It's like you can create a budget, like getting people to track, it kind of increases that self-awareness. You know, there's all these apps out now that will categorize your spending based off of, you know, where you spend it each month, and makes people realize they're like, shit, you know, I spent, you know, $200 at gas stations on snacks, you know, or something like that, or, you know, just random stuff. So it's, or, you know, fast food or whatever. And so it can be pretty eye-opening in that regard. But one question I had for Steve, in situations like, let's take, you know, a non-competitor who's maybe hasn't had much experience tracking previously, and you start working with them, you know, towards fat loss. Do you sometimes go with a more habit-based approach out of the gate versus, you know, going and kind of auditing their behavior through tracking? Like, do you feel like there's a level of education that's required before somebody can start tracking?
Personally, if somebody's open to tracking, I like to have them start with tracking.
Okay.
Just because I feel like if I don't, I'll get all kinds of random questions that would be answered if they were doing full tracking. I don't know, just because I've tried it different ways, and I don't know. I've just if somebody is open to tracking, that's definitely my preferred, because they'll learn so much, and then it just kind of answers a lot of their own questions if they do that. So that's my preferred.
Yeah, I think that's similar to how I've gone about it. I have had athletes that have come to me that, you know, immediately express no interest in tracking, and like I can empathize with that because it can be a pain, you know. So, and in those cases, it's like I sort of default to, okay, let's focus on, you know, almost like checkbox approach. Like, okay, let's 3+ servings of fruits and vegetables a day, you know, check that box. Minimum of this much, you know, 3 liters of water or fluid a day, you know, and so things like that. I think sometimes there are cases where I've been able to kind of bypass the tracking aspect, just because having those objectives in place helps them. It kind of serves the purpose of that auditing behavior. And they're like, oh wow, like 3 servings of fruit and vegetables, like I'm way off from that, you know, and so I have had some success with that, but I agree. Like, I think it's starting with tracking, if they're able to and are open to it, it can be pretty eye-opening. And then pulling away from that, I like the approach you have for that.
Yeah, because I don't know if you've seen this with, like you said, like your non-competitors who've never tracked before, but a lot of the people in that group still have kind of the mindset of good or bad foods. And I found that, like, if I don't have them track everything and just kind of see that it's okay to eat like biscuits and gravy and like they'll be fine, like they almost need to see that they can still eat those foods and still make progress. Right. From just having them track those habits, like they still have this like good or bad like mindset, and like it just kind of clears up a lot of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, if there's fear surrounding specific foods, I think that, I mean, I know I can think back to the first time I started tracking. Like it was coming out of a prep rather than like going into a prep, and it was like super liberating. You know, it was like, oh wow, I can have a bag of popcorn, you know, and it's and I think that's something I probably otherwise would have shied away from. So I can definitely see that being the case, where, you know, getting them to realize, okay, you can still be reaching your goals without, you know, while enjoying these things. I think for some people that probably is necessary.
And I like the way that you program, in the sense of like, you will set a calorie range, you'll set a protein range, and then you'll set a fat minimum. So it's just like this way, because Eric mentioned like not having huge swings in carbs and fats. That's one thing I really like love about your programming, is like you will keep it really wide open, but you will add this one little like, okay, but try to at least get this many grams of fat, but that's all you'll add to that, which I think is a cool way to do it as well.
Yeah, and I think that step's probably not super necessary, the fat, because I feel like very few people are under eating on fat unless they just have like a fear of, you know, the phobia surrounding dietary fat. But
the only time I run into that is when I'm deep into prep and someone like just falls in love with carbs, which sometimes happens, and they're like trying to have as many carbs as they can, and they're kind of like a minimalist for fat and protein, which does sometimes happen. But I also notice there's other issues going on, like they're chasing like the sugary flavor, and they're like eating all the really low fat stuff, and they're often actually reducing their energy density. One thing I do like to do is I will sometimes actually include pictures of the athlete's plate for those who aren't aware of it sometimes. This was developed by a specific group of sports dietitians at, I want to say it was actually at Colorado University. I'm forgetting right now. I'll look it up as I talk. But basically, it's a version of my plate that's built around easy training / weight management, moderate training days, and hard training days. And it is a visual representation of what it looks like. And it's actually been validated in, I want to say it's been published and validated in like the IJSNEM, International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism. So it's the one part of it that like, and when they did the validation, they're like, all right, if we're going to give people, like if dietitians built meals based upon what these plates look like and constructed a whole day of eating, how well does it match up against sport nutrition guidelines? And the bug I see as a feature for strength and physique athletes is that the protein was way too high. So, way too high for the general recommendations, but probably a fine for strength athletes. So that is something that I've actually included on spreadsheets, because you can use that IP freely for educational purposes. But it's pretty cool. The athlete's plate is, I think, a very useful tool. And it's something that when you're not having someone just track macros, like we mentioned earlier, a really useful way to get them to start thinking about things is, okay, well, what does it look like when I sit down to eat? And that can give them a very accurate visual representation. It has a lot of options, like it has vegetarian options for protein sources. And like I said, it has options for higher or lower calorie totals, which I think is quite cool. So anyway, if anyone wants to check that out, we can have that in the show notes. Yeah, I don't know if you guys ever messed around with Athlete's Plate. Are you guys familiar with it?
I haven't actually. I like the idea though.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool. You have, Steve?
No, I like the idea. I want to look it up.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so it's I did look it up. It's at University of Colorado Springs, University of Colorado Springs, and it was developed for like the sport nutrition graduate program in combination with USOC. They're sports dietitians there. It's pretty sweet. Yeah, I can make sure that we get the link in the show notes when we put this out there. But anyway, yeah, I think it's they've actually got these up at a lot of NCAA athlete facilities, and I've seen them with a lot of Olympic athletes as well. It's kind of like pictures in different training halls and stuff like that. And I've used them with a few powerlifters I've worked with for nutrition, who either struggle with tracking or who want to have some structure to their eating, but not necessarily track foods the same way they used to. So in both cases, I found it pretty helpful.
That's cool. I'll have to look at that.
Yeah. One other thing I've done with some of my athletes is, obviously, we're not doing this in a vacuum when we have them tracking different nutrients and going through this transitional process like Steve talked about, or communicating to them the importance of taking a more holistic versus reductionist approach to this stuff. There's coaching that goes on with that. And one of the pieces of information that I try to capture is where are the friction points when they're going with a more food forward approach, if you will. And you run into common issues like there's some people who just struggle to not get enough protein. They struggle to get enough protein, rather, I should say. And I have other people who just really struggle to get enough vegetables or fruits in. Those kind of tend to be two different groups in my experience. I don't know about you guys, but so sometimes what I'll do is I'll figure out like what is the piece that they haven't yet ingrained as a habit, and I'll maintain that kind of type of tracking for a while. So I don't know. Do you guys ever play around with kind of like customized tracking of different foods, or do you ever need to?
Well, it's similar in a sense, but it's never really me who suggests it. It almost comes from the client, but alcohol is a big one. I have a lot of people who, when they start this, they think that I think I'm drinking way too much. And so we'll have a separate column just to track like their drinks per day. And that's probably that's probably the most common, like kind of bonus when I've seen on the side. And again, it's not me saying that, hey, you should probably drink less. It's kind of like they realize that it's affecting things.
Right.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense. How about you, Brian?
I think the big one is fruits and vegetables for me. And I think the barrier, like the friction point, you know, to use that term, for most people, well, there's people that just don't enjoy them, but I find more it's people just don't know how to prepare them. You know, it's like people just don't really like, how do I go about, like, what is a practical, time efficient way to do this? And so, you know, looking at helping them in that regard. I mean, I'm not a chef by any means, but it's like, you know, there's easy ways to go about doing this and still hitting those goals. And, you know, it doesn't require, you know, food prepping for 4 hours on a Sunday afternoon in order to do it. So, but yeah, alcohol is another one. You know, what Steve touched on, that's definitely a big one. And protein can be, you know, at times, especially if, you know, you see it less with physique athletes. I think, you know, with powerlifters, it's probably more common if we're looking at kind of the two different sports. It's like, okay, if we start, you know, they know it's important, but when they do start tracking, that's often like a big point of awareness that they gain. Like, oh wow, I probably could be benefiting from a little bit more. Whereas with physique athletes, it's oftentimes the opposite. But that is, you know, I'll have people that'll, you know, will transition away from tracking, and over time we'll start to, and oftentimes it's the athlete that brings it up, we'll start to notice things kind of starting to slip a little bit. And so it's like these, you know, we'll have like these month-long tracking periods. Like, okay, it's like they lose that awareness of where, like, protein, I know for me personally, if I'm not cognizant of it and I just eat freely, you know, just based off of whatever sounds good at the time, like, protein is going to take a hit, you know? And so keeping on top of that for me is something that I think once I have that in place, like the satiety aspect, you know, that and fruits and vegetables, I feel like if I have those covered, like it's significantly harder for me to, you know, overeat in those situations.
Yeah, 100%. I find if you got someone tracking fruits, vegetables, and protein, and they're regularly hitting those numbers, they can typically maintain weight reasonably well. That's just been my experience. You know, assuming they're exercising and reasonably active, which most of our clients are.
Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez popping in to tell you all about our newest course in the 3DMJ Vault called Calculating Your Macros. Now, I know you're right in the middle of a podcast all about how macros aren't the only thing you should track, and in fact, we don't recommend it for most people all the time, and there are so many other useful and valuable points of data for lifters to pay attention to, etc., etc. But as you've also heard, there are times when it's a very useful thing to learn about, pay attention to, and incorporate into your nutrition journey. So our newest video course is all about that. By the end of the course, you'll know exactly how to set your calories, protein, carbohydrate, and fat intake for both cutting and gaining phases. This is the 18th course in the 3DMJ Vault, and you can become a VIP member to get access to every single one of those courses for just $16.99 per month or $79.99 per year. VIP members will get this Calculating Your Macros course, the Lifting Library, our Contest Prep Q&A collection, the Sustainable Fat Loss course, the Lagging Body Parts course, the Injury Reduction and Management Q&A collection, and many, many more. Go to 3dmjvault.com and sign yourself up today. That's 3dmjvault.com to get all access. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
Sometimes I'm surprised by that this can be a bit of a tough sell to clients. How have you guys gone through kind of the conversations with your athletes where they might be coming from the more strict macro tracking background to a more food forward approach, or just tracking less quantitative variables and focusing more on foods? What does that look like for you guys?
It's funny you mentioned that, because I definitely, especially like rewind a couple of years, ran into that quite a bit. You know, people be like, they would want to work together, and then be like, hey, you know, we're just going to focus on calories and protein and fruits and veggies, and they're like, But what about macros? I'm beyond. I'm better than just calories and protein.
I'm better than this.
And I'm like, no, like really, like just doesn't matter. Like you're wasting energy and time doing that. Like we can try this other stuff, and it just makes me look like I don't know what I'm doing. It's like, why is he not giving me macros? Like, who is this dude? Like, does he not know how to calculate macros? It's like, no, I could do that easily. Like, this is like, we should be doing, like, this is more beneficial. Thankfully, like, I don't like guerrilla market, so I'm not like knocking on doors trying to convert people. So it's like when people come to me, thankfully they're like open, like what they're doing typically is not working. And so they're already open to that. And then if they're open, that's, they'll see progress. And then if they're seeing progress, they're not really going to go back to full tracking. If somebody like really, it's been a long time though. I can't remember the last time I gave somebody full macros. But I guess if somebody really wanted them, I could, throw out some ranges. But like typically, like I said, the person's already open to it, and pretty quickly they enjoy it a lot more. So it's not, it typically hasn't been a huge issue for me recently.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think for me, it's similar as Steve. I think when I have gotten a little pushback from it, first I sort of look at, okay, what aspect of this do you feel like is suboptimal? Like what is your specific concern here? And sometimes it's like, okay, I don't like having an open-ended range for carbs and fats. Like they're sold on the protein, sold on the calories, obviously, but they want firmer parameters there. And so sometimes, depending on the athlete, it can be like a gradual broadening of those ranges to some extent, to give them more autonomy, but also just educating them and making them realize, okay, from like a fat loss perspective, if we're looking at that, if calories and protein are controlled for, there's not a difference, there's not enough evidence to suggest there's like a massive difference. And some people don't realize that. Like some people, feel like, okay, I need to go low carb because that's kind of what I've always done. Or, they feel like they're doing, endurance races and they feel like they need trace fats and a ton of carbs, and like making them realize, okay, we're not maximally depleting glycogen when we're resistance training, and in most cases. So it's knowing that like a moderate approach there fits most people reasonably well. I think some people just aren't aware of that. And so I think that's kind of the first step, like addressing what their area of friction is towards it. And if oftentimes they just have this perception that it's suboptimal, and, getting them to understand like, okay, expenditure varies day to day. Like these are all the things that you think you have control over that you have less than you think, and getting them to look at it through a wider lens. And usually that can help, create some buy-in to start transitioning to, a more food forward approach.
That's great, Brian, because that's exactly where I was going to go with it, is that when someone gives me pushback on this, it's a great conversation starter, because it tells me they have some beliefs about the benefit of tracking macros. And they do typically fall in a couple categories. Kind of one where you ended in what you were saying is that they believe having more precision is better than having less precision. And if there's one thing our industry, like our corner of the industry, is defined by, is being really precise with things that are imprecise. Like, like there are some content creators who are like, there is an optimal hypertrophy rep range and it's 5 to 8. And I look at the research and I'm like, that's never even been compared. Like, what are you talking about? So, like we crave a certain degree of precision, yet the reliability of our tools are typically broader. What I mean by that is that the normal error that we have no control over in many of the tools that we track and on basic physiological variation is greater than the range we're trying to hit. So, like, if you were to look at, and if you were to try to determine what is the manufacturing label standard error on a nutrition label, and also then even if you are tracking your expenditure through, let's say, a Fitbit or something like that, what is its error? And then, okay, then what is your human error? And you compound those all together, your macro tracking to within 5 grams or 10 grams even is going to be more, it's going to be consistent even if you're hitting 250 grams of carbs and 50 grams of fat every single day, you are not hitting 50 grams of fat and 250 grams of carbs every single day. And doing it doesn't actually make that process more precise. So that's one aspect of it. So it's like, okay, are you as precise as you think you are? No, that's impossible. And then the second one is, okay, so what is the benefit of being precise? Can you articulate that to me? And that can fall in a couple of different categories. It can be either, I do think there's a difference between me having, 20 grams more or less of fat and 45 grams more or less of carbohydrate. I think that affects my performance personally. And then the conversation goes to, well, okay, well, if you eat the way you kind of habitually do, because these are almost always really structured people, but we just don't track it, do you think that's going to be your standard error? And then the answer is typically no, I don't. So yeah, it's like, okay, well, you still eat it even if you don't track it. And then honestly, where we typically get to with the people who are giving this much pushback is it's their safety blanket. They feel comfortable doing that. They're used to doing that. They feel a sense of security doing that. And I think that's fine. But it's also just worth asking yourself, and what's the cost of carrying my safety blanket around with me all the time? Do I get weird looks in the office with my thumb in my mouth holding my Banky? And or the social equivalent of that, being the person who's super, super, super on point with all of your numbers. And sometimes there's not, sometimes there is, but I think of course we're client focused. I'm not going to force a client to move outside their comfort zone. But I think that's a question they don't often ask themselves.
Yeah, that's a great point.
There's some other things that I wanted to touch base. Do you guys ever have people focus on sensations or like the function or the impact or the feel of different kind of food combinations or meals? Like I mentioned, my subjective experience, 2019 prep, once I was no longer beholden to having to hit a specific protein or fat target, I could think more about what is this meal going to do for me in a more acute sense rather than it's being, part of this process that's going to take me 9 months or whatever to get shredded. And I would think, okay, this is my last meal of the day. What do I think is going to leave me feeling as satiated as is possible during contest prep? Or, if this is my meal before I'm going to train, where's that right combination for me personally on feeling light enough to go train and not food focused and not hungry? Do you guys ever coach your clients on that or facilitate that process, thinking about meals like that?
Yeah, I typically, I guess I would do it in 3 situations. One would be pre-training, like you're talking about, having people see which foods digest well and lead to better performance, especially people who train first thing in the morning. Just having them test, like, hey, do you train better with just water, or do you train better if you do have like some Gatorade powder before you train, or Gatorade powder and like a little whey protein or whatever. So pre-training, like intra-training, I definitely have people test stuff. Just overall, like each meal and overall satiety. So just what foods, keep you full longer. And the other one is digestion. So paying attention if certain foods cause a lot of digestive issues, or which ones don't, which ones just make you feel better, like physically throughout the day. So those are kind of the 3 different, situations that have people kind of focus on how different foods make them feel. And a lot of times it's like, it's just trial and error. If somebody, because a lot of times what I try to do too is let's say it's not super uncommon for somebody to come and say, hey, like X, Y, and Z, I feel like something's going on if I eat that, like I feel bad. And so in a safe way, making sure it's safe, but like I'll have them experiment with having some of those foods, because maybe they think they have a certain intolerance. Obviously, if they think they have like a full-blown allergy and they're getting some serious symptoms, I'm not going to run this test in my house. But like if it's, like I said, a safe way, if they really think like, hey, I think I can't have this food or it's going to cause an issue, I will have them test that like in a smaller quantity, or typically it's quantity. Like I don't know, like the gluten one's probably the most common one. Like somebody thinks they have a gluten sensitivity, but it's because they like never really eat gluten until they have a ton of it. And I'm like, okay, well, it's like, why don't we just try like a little bit of it? Or somebody's like, hey, whenever I have, and a lot of times it could be fear based, like, hey, if I have any kind of like fast digesting carb, like I just immediately, my energy just crashes. but it's because like when they have that, it's like a ton of like cake or a ton of ice cream. Like, why don't we try a smaller quantity of that and see if like you still feel like crap after you have just a smaller quantity, or if it has something to do with the overall quantity that you're having. So that's kind of a side thing, but I don't know, if I see like food fears kind of hanging out that I feel like don't need to be there, I will try to have people address those. Like I said, as long as it's safe. I'm just going to say that again. I know it's just like having people test things that I really think, hey, you need to go like see a board certified allergist or go talk to your physician. You know, I'm not doing that, but like when possible, yes.
So what you're saying is you're not having people test out their nut allergy.
I do that one. Just kidding. Just kidding.
I think you might be mistaken.
I think it's all in your head.
We're going to see if you go into anaphylactic shock. We're going to get some shellfish and just stuff them with peanuts. And let me know how you go.
Wrap it in soy wraps.
If I don't hear from you, I'll expect you're fine.
I'll assume. No, I mean, you summed it up well, Steve. I think those are all aspects that, you know, I've discussed at some point in the past. You know, one thing you touched on that I think I was going to mention was like the quantity aspect, you know, where people feel, you know, there's a specific food group or something that they just don't tolerate well, but when they're having those experiences, they're just having perhaps just above the threshold that maybe they should be having. And so one thing, I don't know if you touched on this or not, I was going to mention like cognitive performance. Like sometimes I'll have people, you know, in the morning, they'll say like, okay, I'm not super hungry in the morning. And if I have like a lot of carbs, like I feel like I'm just not as sharp. And that's actually something I've kind of noticed with myself over the years. I feel like if I have like a carb heavy breakfast, I just kind of feel lethargic. But if I just have protein and maybe a little bit of fat, like I do feel, you know, let's say calories are equated. I tend to feel better mentally off slightly lower carbs. And so just having people pay attention to that, because there's a lot of variability. There's people that feel the opposite. So, and I'm sure some of that just has to do with, you know, blood sugar regulation and things like that. And so, you know, another thing that I'll have people look at is, like if they're having GI distress or anything around training, like, okay, let's look at fat intake, you know, pre-training, you know, sometimes keeping that on the lower end can be helpful. And then there's other people that they might feel they kind of crash mid-session. So either introducing like an intra-workout shake, you know, some type of, you know, Gatorade powder, something like that. Or if they are able to, maybe adding a little bit of dietary fat to the pre-training meal to kind of slow things down a bit. So, so yeah, I think there's a lot of different, you know, places, you know, that we can go with that. But, you know, I think you covered everything pretty well.
Yep, I agree. And I find people tend to, well, not all people. Some of the people I have to, where I coach on this topic tend to fall into two sides of kind of the normal bell curve. One being the people who are maybe a little too focused on their sensations and their response to foods. Sometimes I think there's fear associated with that, or, you know, lingering beliefs about foods, which I think have some degree of psychosomatic effect. I don't necessarily think it's always changing their experience of how the food affects them, but I think they eat the food that they used to be afraid of, and then they're hyper focused on how they feel afterwards. So they're noticing their digestion a lot after it. They're looking for something. And yeah, if you bring more attention to your digestion, you're going to be more aware of it. And sometimes when working with those people, it's worth them asking questions about, like, you know, how do you feel? And what do you associate with when you feel a little bloated? And I feel fat, or I feel sluggish, or I feel like there's something wrong with me. And knowing that, like everybody feels bloated sometimes is sometimes useful information. That's totally normal. You know, like it's not fun for other people when you fart, but it is something that does happen to everyone. So, you know, like these they're not always easy conversations to have. And again, I really glad you kept emphasizing safety, Steve, but I had a number of times where it's like, sometimes you just got to let your digestive tract do its thing. It's, and also we're making changes to what you eat. So there's probably going to be a transitional period here, but you're not in danger. You're okay. And if you find after, a few months of eating this way that it's still the same, it's uncomfortable, and you're not enjoying it, that's okay. We can shift back to some of the eating patterns we had before and find a middle ground. I remember when I started eating a lot more vegetables more regularly and more intentionally, my GI tract was a bit of a mess for like a month and a half, and I won't go into any more details than that because there's no need to, and it would be terrible. But things did improve, and they got better than my baseline in terms of my regularity and things like that. The other side of the bell curve is interesting too, though, and it's kind of how I used to be, which is just kind of like the whatever. I don't think about any of that stuff, and I don't have associations like Ryan, like you had on if I eat different types of breakfasts and how I feel, or I mean the kind of like typically it's like younger lifters who I notice this. Like, so I had a large pizza and then I went and did legs, and you're like, wait, hold on, what? Like let's dissect that a little bit. Have some kind of thought around what you did, and they sometimes just don't pick up on those associations because either they're kind of weak because they have generally stable performance. And there's a balance to how you talk to them about that, in my experience, which is you don't want to make them become like super phobic of any foods or overly focused on this. Like, to some degree, their baseline is a good thing. Like, I just let my body do its thing and I don't worry about it. But if there are opportunities for, especially when you're working with them in the off season, they haven't competed yet, and they move into a place where their performance cognitively, emotionally, and physically is going to be a little more precarious and variable, you want to build some awareness and tools before they get into that spot. So I think I've been in the spot of coaching people on both sides of that, and I think it's a tool set that is important to build as a coach, in my opinion.
You shared some really good points there that I just want to second. The first one is that like everyone feels bloated at points, everyone feels hungry at points, everyone that is a huge one. It's not trying to avoid those sensations forever, but like everyone is going to have that at some point. I thought that was really cool. And the other thing you said with the upping fruits and veggies and noticing some GI distress, that is also super common. So it's like the way I typically do it is I will slowly up their fruit and veggie count or slowly up their fiber count over a period of weeks versus just dumping 4 vegetables and 2 fruits when they're not having any. So again, I also second that. It's like I've seen it's pretty common if somebody ups it too quickly that they do initially get some of those symptoms, but the symptoms do go away. But you can avoid a lot of those if you just go a little bit slower.
Steve, I know you and I have talked about this over email some, but about fiber specifically. And I think most people in general, I'd say on average, are probably consuming a little bit under what the recommended fiber intake is. And so I've gotten, is it 14 grams per 1,000 up to a point?
Up to a point, yeah.
Up to like 2,700 calories or something, I think. But yeah, like when I started using those numbers, like a lot of people, it's like their jaws kind of drop. It's like you look at that, like that gradual transition is important to reinforce because sometimes that's triple what they're currently consuming, especially if they're coming from a background of, just focused primarily on macronutrients themselves, and they're not really considering the qualitative side of things. Or, if they're in prep or something like that, and it's, sometimes you see people on the opposite end of the spectrum there where they kind of go all in on food volume, where it's like their fiber just skyrockets, and it's almost like we need to pull that back a little bit because there's probably some bloating that's occurring here that's simply a result of going overboard. And then there's the people, it's like, okay, my cravings for specific, calorically dense options are there. I'm just going to have, make these concoctions, that are satisfying that craving and completely void of fiber, and like I'll deal with the hunger just so I can have this. So that's always interesting to me to see kind of during, prolonged fat loss phases, how different people's behaviors change and how some of these habits can kind of shift based on how they're feeling, as they continue to get leaner. And I think contest prep's always like a great case study for that because, people's perspectives and their cravings and satiety levels can radically shift across that duration. And so, I think that's something, especially like in prep where tracking with maybe a little bit more detail has some value, when you're in a deficit, not abandoning like the fundamentals of like fruits and vegetables during those times as well, because I think it can go overboard in either direction. But do you find that, I guess both of you, do you find that a lot of athletes that have come to you are under consuming on fiber on average?
I have seen both. I was recently consulting with someone and their basic diet was lean meats, fruits and vegetables, and they would just increase those proportions or decrease them. And we did some carbohydrate loading towards the end of their diet, and I made the mistake of not being a little more explicit about food sources for that. And there was a very visible physique change to where essentially from like the nipples down to the top of the hips just became completely smooth and a pregnant belly. And this was a male, so they were not pregnant. And I immediately was sent back and I was like, my bad, dude. I can tell you had a whole bunch of fruits and vegetables to hit this like 2 times your habitual carbohydrate intake. Here's how I want you to do that. And am I right? Like to make sure that something crazy isn't going on, like you didn't get like a bee sting or whatever, and and have an allergic reaction. And he was like, no, that's exactly what I did. And yeah, it's coming down already by today when I responded to this email. But I was like, yeah, dude, you probably doubled your fiber intake and you already had a high fiber intake. And that's a lot of, food bulk to get processed through some probably slightly atrophied intestines after this, long dieting period that you've been on. And it also reminded me of way back in the day, I won't say his name, but a client we used to work with like 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, I think. And he was transitioning to not only just if it fits your macros from tracking, but also just not just tracking clean foods. Like there was this interesting people who existed and when If It Fits Your Macros started to get popular, who were like, yeah, cool, I can track my macros. Well, I'm only going to eat the good foods though, right? So it's like, oh, you're getting the worst of both. So, and he had a very high energy expenditure. And I want to say of his 550 grams of carbohydrates, through 200 to 300 of them were coming from oats. And I shit you not, he looked like an enhanced IFBB Pro bodybuilder for his stomach with a natural physique athlete's body around it. So it's like, I got only the side effects of GH and none of the benefits or something like that. And this is, again, the most striking acute visual change I've seen. We convinced him to bring his oats down to half of what it was and just to start including like Ben & Jerry's Froyo. Because he had a really high fat and he had over 100 grams of fat per day to play with, 550 grams of carbohydrate, easily worked that in. And within like the next time we saw him, he was coming down to do like posing practice with us. The gut was completely gone. So it wasn't just like his structure or anything like that. And all of a sudden, like he probably lost like 2 inches off his waist, without any change in body composition. So I've seen that, just to answer an interesting way of answering that question. But I definitely think the default these days is people who are just under and transitioning them slowly in a tapered fashion up. So you're not getting what happened to my carb-loaded colleague is the way to go. Or you can kind of throw a wrench in the proverbial digestive gears.
And it's got to be like 80 grams of protein from oats.
Yeah, no shit.
Yeah, I've seen it. It depends on the background somebody comes from. Like if somebody comes from more of the traditional like eat clean foods background, their fiber is more on the high side. If they come from like they just started with If It Fits Your Macros, it's more of like, oh, I don't really eat fruits and veggies. I just try to hit my macros. yeah, I found that it kind of depends on where they started from and where they're at.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I know we've talked about it, I think, in other episodes, and we've talked about it off air and stuff, but that's why I like kind of the 60-gram limit per day for fiber. Not like a hard limit, but I try to keep that being try not to go above 60 grams per day. That's just a good kind of rule of thumb to go by. So like you're saying, Brian, 14 grams per 1,000 calories up to a point, but then obviously pay attention to how you feel and if you're getting some symptoms, and then kind of keep that 60 grams per day. And also it depends on because obviously there's a bunch of different types of fiber. Fiber has many different properties, and I know personally, it depends on where I'm getting that fiber from. Like if no shade, but if I crush 2 Quest bars in one sitting, I'll feel very bloated. Just because it's just isolated soluble corn fiber, and if you have 2 of those, it's 28 grams of that. That's just a personal thing. I mean, some people could probably crush 3 and be fine, but that's something I've noticed. If I have too much isolated corn fiber, I'm gonna feel bloated and jello-y. So just kind of all those things. Again, it kind of goes back to just paying attention to how different foods make you feel.
So do you guys, how often in the pursuit of helping people understand how foods make them feel, are you using satiety or hunger scales and having them track that?
Quite a bit. I mean,
Yeah.
I do. Yeah. That's something I always sort of refer back to, baseline, off-season hunger. If we're using a diet as an example, that's a piece of data that I try to collect, each check-in with people is where is your baseline hunger comparatively? And sometimes it's just, you have to kind of differentiate, is this a byproduct of food choices, or is this a byproduct of a deficit and a significant amount of fat loss that's more or less unavoidable? Because there's a lot of people, they get deep into a diet and they're hungry and they're like, what do I need to be doing differently? And in some cases it's nothing, it's that's just kind of part of it. But in other situations, it's okay, we could be adjusting your intake, eating more fruits and vegetables. Eric, I know when we were in Australia, 2019, for your food prep, your show prep, you were talking about the satiety index and it's looking at foods on there that can help, I think is boiled white potatoes are one of the most satiating foods. So, having tools like that can help people when it does come down to food selection, within the parameters of their plan. But, if we're speaking about bodybuilders in prep, it's they're already doing kind of what they can to manage satiety. And at that point, it's this is just, you signed up for this part of the process pretty much.
Yeah, I'll do it in a similar way. I'll use it in 2 ways. Just overall, a 1 through 10, how hungry were you this day? Just a very broad bird's eye view. But then if I have somebody who's struggled with overeating, that's where I'll use that more precise hunger fullness scale that I've talked about on other podcasts and in the course, and I can break it down again. But I can also link maybe a video, because I don't know, it's related to that, but I don't know if I'll go that way, but yeah, I'll use that. I'll use that scale if somebody feels hey, I just don't know when I'm hungry, when I'm full. I'm either starving or I'm overly full. I'm having a hard time there in the middle. I'll use that to help them kind of develop that awareness. And I guess I will circle back to what I was going to say, because why not? It's snacking. I get a lot of questions around snacks, when people should snack and stuff. And so that's why I made that video for 3DMJ a couple months ago called, I think it was called strategic snacking or something. Just because the way I see a snack is there should be doesn't have to be, but there should be a purpose behind it, either to improve performance or to keep you from getting too hungry. And so if somebody is trying to figure out when they should snack, that's a good time to help them also learn about their hunger and fullness signals. It's hey, our goal is to keep you from getting too hungry, which is below a 3 on that scale. So if you feel yourself getting below a 3, and yeah, it's not a situation where you're at the end of a prep and you're just going to be hungry at times, but if we can keep you above a 3, that's a good time to throw in a snack. So I'll use that. I'll use that tool a decent amount.
Got it. Yeah, I like that. One question I get from people when I ask them to track hunger or satiety is when should I be tracking it? Should I be doing this on a per meal basis? Am I reflecting on this just when I do my report? Is it end of day? Do you guys find there's a particular way you like to give them guidance on that, or does it make a difference?
If I'm doing the meal by meal thing, I'll have them do it every meal. I'll have them do it right before they sit down to eat, and then I'll have them wait 20 minutes after they eat and give themselves like a post meal rating. And they might do that for a week or 2 weeks, but doing it every meal to like really just develop the habit of like this way they don't forget to do it. Yep. And I'll even have them like record that in like the notes section, like in their journal that I give them. Like, hey, just put what was your like pre-meal hunger rating and your post-meal hunger rating, your fullness rating, and just do that for every meal and snack for a week.
How about you, Brian?
I've used both. Probably more often than not, though, I think it's looking at it through like at the time of the check-in. And just kind of rating like, okay, where was your satiety relative to baseline this week? And I think for the most part, like unless you're trying to like get them to tune into what these cues mean, you know, like Steve's describing, I mean, I feel that's been sufficient in most cases for me, because most people can, you know, look back and I feel state with relative accuracy, like, was I much more hungry this week than I was last, or, you know, vice versa. But I think both have value. I think looking through kind of a wide lens gives you a lot of information. But when there is like volatility on a day-to-day basis, like sometimes I'll see in, you know, the notes section of, you know, the spreadsheet, you know, was ravenously hungry this day. And so that's where, you know, I might look at things like sleep, you know, stress, you know, surrounding those days, and see, you know, if that's impacting things, or, you know, cravings were high this day. You know, if it's a female, maybe looking, you know, where are we at in relation to their menstrual cycle, and then looking at, you know, I think sleep's a big one. It seems like when people are sleep deprived, there tends to be quite a bit more volatility when it comes to satiety ratings.
Yeah, I think there are, I echo all those sentiments, and B, I think there are different ways to use tracking hunger and satiety. And I think a check-in based reflection on the week is a totally valid way of doing it. And it's kind of my default, because it gives me information that might trigger a conversation that might result in substantive coaching changes related to, like you said, sleep hygiene, or modifying, you know, food selection, or making suggestions about maybe making a more regular eating pattern if they don't have that. All the various things I think might be able to better regulate things. Maybe even getting their step count a little higher or a little lower, or just not dieting as hard, you know. So there's a lot of things that could result in based upon the context. But I think 100%, if you are having someone think about pre and post meal satiety on a meal to meal basis for a week, you're essentially helping them, you know, exercise that muscle and build that awareness, kind of like we talked about earlier. And if you look at the research on mindfulness, mindful eating, which it's often misunderstood as what it is really just bringing attention to the act of eating. And it is nothing, doesn't need to be anything more than that, but it does have positive benefits. And it sometimes results in a passive reduction in energy intake because people are just paying attention. And I think most of the time, even in the fitness community, people tend to eat without paying attention to the process of eating. And that is to some degree a luxury for some. You know, I work from home, so I typically can do that, but not everyone does. Some people are eating in the car. Some people are eating during meetings. Some people are, you know, whatever, insert kind of the typical experience in your career field or your life circumstances, and that's hard to do. But at the very least, you are mindful to your body signals before and after eating if you're doing what Steve advised, and that might be something like that might not be what you were initially thinking when you decided to give the guidance to track hunger and satiety. It's like, oh, I want them to develop this tool, but I think that's a kind of a bigger side benefit from it that the people are getting. So I think there's benefits to doing both either or, depending on the context and the goal of what you're trying to accomplish.
I agree.
Yeah, I think we've covered a broad bit here, and obviously when we go through the list of what is there to track and what might have utility beyond just the macros, there's the first at the top of the list is less than all the macros. Just looking at protein and calories and providing some useful benefits of providing less restriction on what someone can eat. And then there's things on top of that like fruits, vegetables, satiety, hunger, sleep. We didn't talk about it, but water. I will sometimes have certain athletes track who struggle to actually get water in or fluids in. That's actually something that I find I do better with when I track. We talked about setting up guidance around structured plates or kind of visualizations of food. So I think there's a lot to be done here, and it really depends upon where your client's at. So yeah, those are my closing thoughts, just to make people realize that there are benefits to this stuff, and there are potential negative and positive side effects to how you ask your clients to track things. And if you have kind of an overly precise view of certain things where there aren't precision, while ignoring certain things like qualitative sensations around training for fullness or digestibility, or during dieting, fullness and hunger, you're potentially, putting a lot of energy where it doesn't help and missing opportunities where that energy could be placed that could help. So that's all I've got to say. But Steve, Brian, anything you want to add before we sign off?
No, I just agree with what you said. Like you said, instead of putting all the energy into tracking maybe all the macros, you could zoom out and put that energy into tracking, like you said, how different foods make you feel, or playing around with tracking hunger and fullness either on a daily basis or a meal-to-meal basis, basically taking the same amount of energy and redistributing that into places that would be more helpful for you at this point.
And I think in terms of bottom line outcome, which, most of us are working with people, either trying to improve body composition or strength. Like, I feel like if you get those habits in place, like a lot of the other stuff, it's just going to be so much easier for that stuff to naturally fall into place, just kind of as a byproduct of it. Like, I've noticed a lot more success with that lately. Kind of getting away from tracking for a bit and then maybe going back to it seems to help. So yeah, I thought it was a productive conversation for sure.
Yeah, real quick, Brian, that's a great point. Like, once you take away tracking, you got to kind of get to see what's stuck, like what's actually a habit and what's not quite yet a habit. Because I like run little periods like that where you do a couple of weeks of like, hey, let's just not track the details, but just let's see what's stuck. And like sometimes you find out when somebody has like a crazy week and they just weren't able to track for whatever, you see, okay, what is really a habit and what's like, okay, we still need to be working on that.
100%. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate both your time and energy and thoughts on this. Make sure to check out the notes on this podcast, because there's a lot of great things to link to the Transitioning Away from Tracking course in the Vault. The YouTube content that we have here at the Team 3DMJ YouTube channel, where some of the stuff that Steve referenced is, as well as some of the publications that kind of give some tools that are freely used, like Athlete's Plate. So once again, thank you for listening to the 3DMJ podcast, and we will catch you next time.